Welcome to DWBIADDA channel. Please subscribe for latest training videos.
In today's tutorial, we're going to learn about batch processing in Mule 4 and learn how batch processing and batch jobs can help us process big data sets or a large number of records. So batch processing is normally used when dealing with large data sets or when synchronizing data between two applications. So let's see how we can use batch processing and configure a batch job in our flow. So I've created a batch processing job here with a batch processing XML. So let me walk you through the flows in our batch processing XML. So here we have our file to database flow. What we're trying to do in our file to database flow is basically use a batch job to transfer data from a file that we'll be reading using the read operation and transfer it into 4 different databases depending on certain conditions. So batch processing, what it does is basically strips down a large data set into a set of records and processes the set records one by one. So in our file read operation, we'll be trying to read our new students.json file. In our new students.json file, we have an array consisting of 100 student objects, and each student object is made up of 6 fields: first name, last name, department, age, ID, and date of birth. So what we'll be doing in our flow is basically, depending on the department of each student, process each object of each student and try to insert them into their corresponding databases. So we have databases for 4 different engineering streams. We have mechanical, computers, civil, and IT. So a mechanical students database will contain all the mechanical students, and computers will contain computer students, and similarly for civil and IT branches. So let me walk you through the components in the flow. So we have the HTTP listener as our trigger. We have the file read operation that has been configured to read our new students.json file. Next, we have a transform message. And after the transform message, we have our batch job. So a batch job is made up of 2 sections, that is process records and on complete. And a process record section is made up of again 2 sections, which is aggregator and our processors. Aggregator is used when we want to process our payload in a batch size of greater than 1. So in our processor section, all the records will be processed as 1. So each object will be processed as 1 record. But if we wanted to group these records in a group of maybe 2, 5 or 10 or any number, we will have to put an aggregator here, a batch aggregator in our aggregator section. And we can configure our aggregator size. If we say 25, our batch aggregator scope will create 4 records. Since we have 100 students in our database or 100 objects in our payload, and our batch aggregator size is 25, so each record will contain 25 objects and 4 records will be created and processed depending on the processes we add in our batch aggregator. We won't be using batch aggregator here, and we will try to process the objects one by one as a record. So in our batch job, we have a set variable component that we use to set the department of the particular student. So once our payload enters the batch job converted, our batch job scope will convert the payload into a collection of 100 records, and each record will pass through the batch steps one by one. So we have one batch step in our batch job here. If we wanted to add another batch step in our batch job, we can simply drag a batch step and put it here. So that will create another batch step. So what batch step means is that each record will pass through the first batch step, and once all the records have passed through the first batch step, in the same way all the records will again pass through batch step 2 and outside of our process record section. There's no need for 2 batch steps in our flow, so we'll delete the second one. And in our first batch step, what we're trying to do is set a variable called department for each student, and then we're using a logger to log each record in our console. After our logger component, we have a choice router. This is where things get a little interesting. So in a choice router, what we are trying to do is basically depending on the department variable of each payload, we're trying to populate the 4 different databases that we have here. So we have the mech, comp, civil and IT. So if the department of a student is mech, the choice flow will direct the flow towards the first insert statement, and in our insert statement, we basically have a query for entering a student into our student's mech database. And these are the input parameters we'll be using to input our student object into the database. Similarly, if a student's department is comp, it will be populated into the comp database and civil and IT. And in our default scope, we have a transform message saying that the department of the student contains an invalid value. And lastly, in our onComplete phase, we have a logger to log the message batch processing completed. So what happens in our batch flow is all the records will pass through batch step 1, and once all the records have passed through the batch step 1, our batch job will direct the flow towards the onComplete phase. And in the onComplete phase, if we look in our payload, you can see that we have a batch job result. So this is generated by default for every batch job. It contains the total number of records, the failed records and other parameters. So we have 4 other flows in our batch processing XML. So each of these flows get mech students, get comp students, get civil students and get IT students basically query the database for each department and return the values or the data stored in them. So my application is running right now. Let us query each of these 4 department databases and see if they hold any student values. You can see that our mech department table is empty. Similarly, our comp table is empty as well. So are the other 2. So we'll now run our batch job and see if these databases get populated. So our batch job has finished execution and we can see that a batch job Java object has been downloaded. Since our batch job results a Java object, our Chrome browser has automatically downloaded the payload returned by the batch job. So let us go to Studio and look at a console. So in our console, we can see that thanks to the logger in our batch step, we have been able to log every object in our payload. If we go to the very end, we can see that our logger in the onComplete phase has logged the message batch processing completed. And if we look further down, we can see that our batch job has logged a message finished execution for instance of batch job, and we can see the total records processed. We can see the total records processed, the successful records and the failed records as well. So since our successful records are 100, our department tables should have been populated by now, and let's query them again and see if they have been populated. We can see that the IT department table has been populated with a list of students. Similarly, if you look for comp database, that is populated as well. Similarly for mech and civil. So we can see that all 4 of our databases have been populated depending on the department of each student that we had defined. So our batch job has worked like a charm and we have been able to populate all 4 of our databases. Another thing that we can configure for our batch job is the total number of failed records. So we can see here maximum failed records has been set to 0. So this means if there was an error in the processing of even one of our records, our batch job would stop execution and return an error back to the server. So if we had a value of 5 here, this means that on the 6th error or the 6th record that throws an error will cause the batch job to stop execution and return an error message. So that is how we can use a batch job to process a large payload. Today we processed a payload containing 100 objects, but batch jobs can be used to process datasets containing millions of records. So that is it guys for today's tutorial. Hope you guys have learned how you can use batch job in Mule 4.